Good morning again, Eastridge Chapel class. If you remember last week's video, then you know why I'm in my backyard today as opposed to the office. But for those who may have missed it, you are in part 2 of an accidental 2-part series. I shot this class intending for it to be one long class and then realized I had way too much content for one class. So this morning, the content kind of dives right in. There's not a lot of intro part, so I wanted to record this to recap where we are. Last week, we looked at Luke 24. We began in verse 13. We are still going to be there this morning. So Luke chapter 24, beginning in verse 13. This story is two disciples on the road to Emmaus. These disciples have just experienced a traumatic event in losing Jesus. And in their experience in these few verses, we get a really, really interesting blueprint for us in dealing with trauma as well. I want to encourage you to watch part 1 from last week before you dive too deeply into part 2 today. But to quickly recap, last week we focused really intentionally on the internal experience of trauma. Again, that will set the stage for the conversation this afternoon. But today, the content is going to focus more specifically and more intentionally on the collective experience. I'm going to give you concrete questions to ask within your family that will allow you to take this collective trauma that we are experiencing as a culture and allow it to grow your family. I really want to encourage you to pause on those questions and actually ask them. I will put them again at the end of the video. So if you want to keep rolling through class and then at the end push pause on the final slide, you will see those questions again. But without further ado, here is part 2 of A Disciple's Guide to Trauma. Our text for this morning is Luke chapter 24, The Road to Emmaus. I hope you benefit from it in some way. Okay, so these disciples are processing the trauma of what's happened over the course of the past few days. They are moving, they are processing, and then something happens in the midst of their processing. Jesus shows up. And like last week, he hides himself. I want to remind you, he could have done this however he wanted. He could have instantly cured their sadness. He chooses instead to walk with them in their hurt and to join them in their processing. I want to read verse 17. And he said to them, "What is this conversation that you're holding with each other as you walk?" And they stood still, looking sad. In the midst of trauma, Jesus shows up. He walks the road with them. He helps them process, and he reveals truths to them. He ministers to them, but at no point do they actually know that it's Jesus. Now, I've made this point in almost every video we've done, and it's not an accident. It keeps popping up in these stories. Just because we don't recognize Jesus doesn't mean that he isn't there. As a mental health clinician, the way Jesus chooses to enter into this story is really powerful for me. And the reason is because he chooses to get in the pit with the disciples and join them in their grief and join them in the conversation. I say that because clinically speaking, I'm going to give you a picture of what a good counselor is supposed to do. If you see somebody in a pit, they're sinking, they're in the mud, the general response from people tends to be to want to stand outside the pit, to reach down and try to pull people out of it. That's not what counselors are supposed to do. Counselors are not supposed to stand on the edge of the pit and pull. Counselors are supposed to get in the pit with the person. And then together, you walk your way out. Jesus does this in this moment. He is the great counselor for a reason. His interaction with these disciples is so powerful to me as a clinician because, again, he doesn't show up and reveal himself and say, guys, there's nothing to be sad about. You misunderstood what was going on. Let me explain it. Instead, that would be standing on the outside of the pit and pulling them. They would get there, but it would be Jesus simply revealing that truth that got them there. For some reason, he wanted them to process. And we know that because he went through this long conversation with them. He's processing with them. Jesus in this moment is in the pit with these disciples who are hurting. He decides that the best, most impactful way to help these disciples is to walk alongside them, to help them through their pain, to give them insight, and to do that all while remaining unrecognizable. And it's my speculation and my speculation alone, but I think Jesus is doing this because these disciples wouldn't get to the necessary truths if they jumped into joy too quickly. They're hurting. They're in pain. This story starts with disciples walking a road. It doesn't say that they're walking slowly, but I imagine they are because they've just been through a traumatic experience. The story begins with disciples walking a lonely road. They are hurting, but they're actually in a really good place because they're talking, they're thinking, they're processing. And Jesus doesn't hurry that process, and he doesn't end it abruptly by appearing and getting them to joy too quickly. If you are hurting, as weird as this sounds, trying to get to joy too quickly can actually set you back. You'll miss the best window of time for you to process. One of the most important things that I try to do clinically is to give people permission to feel what they're already feeling, and then try to encourage them to stay with that feeling as long as they need to. We're uncomfortable with negative emotions, and so we just kind of want them to go away. In trauma, you don't get over things, you get through them. Over implies you can skip stuff. Over means there's things underneath that you didn't have to touch. You don't get over things in trauma. In trauma, you have to get through it. And it happens one thing at a time. And it happens slowly. And it happens intentionally. And you have to be okay staying with negative emotions from time to time. Husbands, you're going to have to be okay with the fact that your wife is going to be super stressed out sometimes. Wives, you're going to have to be okay with the fact that your husband is going to be super stressed out sometimes. Parents, you're going to have to be okay with the fact that your kids are struggling. Family members, you're going to have to be okay with the fact that people you love are going to have to go through some negative things right now in order to process. That is okay. You have to be intentional. You have to accept that it may take time, and that pain and hurt aren't just okay. They're a valuable part of the process. They're a necessary part of the process. Don't run from that. Embrace it. Because in that embrace, I think you'll move through it much quicker than you could have by avoiding it. So to recap, they're moving slowly, they're processing, and their conversation was an attempt to make sense of the trauma that they had experienced. In that conversation, Jesus reveals the spiritual necessity of the trauma that they've experienced. I'm going to pick up reading in verse 26. Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory? And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. In these words, Jesus is turning the trauma from devastating to beneficial, from senseless to necessary. Jesus is helping these disciples find value in the experience of the trauma. And this is where things get tricky in terms of dealing with trauma in our world and in our lives. If you try to see value in it too quickly, it seems insensitive and callous. A lot of very well-intentioned family members and ministers and even counselors have been accused of being insensitive because they tried to get somebody who was hurting to see the value in their trauma before that person was ready. I wonder if maybe that's why Jesus let them tell him the story of what they had been through before he offers this. Maybe giving them that processing time allows them to be open to moving into the part of the conversation that starts to move towards the positive, the spiritual necessity of this conversation. I know that's how counseling works. Jesus waits until they're ready and then explains how everything they're hurting over was a part of the plan all along. Finding value in pain sounds really insensitive if you haven't been through the experience of processing. But if you've processed, if you've moved intentionally, one thing at a time, finding value in your pain is essential, regardless of what the root of that pain is. You may hear me this morning and think to yourself, yeah, when we're talking about like the trauma of the economics of the coronavirus, yeah, we can see value in that, but you don't know what I've been through. You don't know my trauma. That's fair. I don't. But I'm not going to change what I just said. That finding value in that trauma is vital. I'm going to give you some examples of clinically where I would hope to see value in some things that may not seem to have value. I've had clients who've struggled with depression, who've discovered that their depression made them more attuned to other people's emotions than they ever could have been otherwise. It gave them a deep-seated empathy that allowed them to see things in other people that those other people didn't see. I've had clients who've come from abuse,
who have discovered that their history made them very loving and attentive parents who additionally learned to rely on God because even their most treasured earthly relationships fell short. And so that pushed them back to trusting fully and completely on God. I've had clients who've been through a traumatic event who have discovered a newfound ability to see God in places they never thought to look for him before. Listening to those stories is really powerful. It also taught them that they were stronger than they ever knew they were. It taught them that memories and experiences only have the power that we give them. So they're able to take control over their feelings in powerful, powerful ways. Folks, pain with no growth just hurts. Pain with growth changes lives. My plan today was to try to connect this scriptural moment to the process of healing from trauma, and then to connect that shared trauma that we see in this moment to the world that we're living in now. Jesus helped these disciples find meaning in their pain. He explained to them in great detail how the trauma that they experienced was not only beneficial, but it was necessary. Can we do the same right now? Our collective pain right now is rooted in the collapse of our economy, and the loss of jobs. The virus, yes, but for most of us, especially here in Texas, exponentially more of you are being harder hit by the economics of this than the virus itself. So how do we find value in that? I'm going to give you a weird pathway forward. Again, those of you who know me know that I do a lot of treatment for digital stuff. I did a dissertation on the impact of social networking on marriage. And so I work with families and couples a lot for social media addiction or for digital addiction. And you know what we try to do? In the early stages, we try to ramp down the usage. So we try to go from like an uncontrollable 8 hours a day in front of a screen to try to move it down to where it looks a little bit more manageable. We're going to just kind of wean it down. But the goal is I want at least a 4-day window of extinction. And what that means is a 4-day window where there's no technology at all. So I want 4 days. And for the record, for most of the families I've worked with in this, I encourage them to go take a trip. Go be gone for 4 days where you can leave your phones. You can leave all the electronic stuff behind. But I need at least 4 days of extinction. And during those 4 days of extinction, we reprocess. We have a plan in place for what we want it to look like when we get back. We've already talked. Okay, what's a healthy usage look like? And so we've got a working plan that we're working with. After the extinction period, we come back, and because we've had this moment of nothingness, resetting a new normal is way, way easier. But you know what's really hard? Getting that extinction period. It is really hard to get families to commit to 4 days. And by the way, I say 4 days. It doesn't have to be exactly 4 days. I say 4 days because I need the family to hear more than a weekend. But trying to get, I would love to have a week. But most families can't do that. Most families, because of their schedules, they just can't do that. So 4 days is enough to have an impact, but it's the bare minimum amount of time. But the problem is that extinction period, finding 4 uninterrupted days is really, really, really hard. To get families to strip away their routine long enough to make substantial change is a challenge. But we can do that right now. You are in an extinction period that you did not intend to be in. Right now, you're in a moment where you can reformulate your family time, your commitment to your faith, your financial future. What I really need with the digital addiction process is a plan. So after the extinction period, when things begin to return to normal, what do you want it to look like? So today, I want to give you a plan as well. A way to make the struggle we're in right now actually beneficial. The reset button was hit for you. Everything's been thrown off, everything's been stripped away, but we are nearing the end, and I will maintain that I am confident of that. The question is, what will normal look like for you and your family? So I want to encourage you this morning to explore 3 questions, ideally with your spouse and your family. I'm going to put those 3 questions before you now. First, what changes do we want to make to our family's allocation of time when this crisis is over? What would our ideal normal week look like in terms of time commitments? That should be an ongoing dialogue right now while everything has been thrown off. Next, what changes do we want to see in the spiritual life of our family? What is our ideal new normal when the stay-at-home order ends? Question 3, what changes do we want to see in our financial habits when things return to normal? Are there ways we can be more intentional about saving or about cutting unnecessary costs? Questions like these can help you and your family find value in what is a very painful, traumatic collective experience. Give yourselves room to process the negative emotions first. Don't skip that step. If there's negativity, if there's pain, if there's hurt inside that needs to come out, let that happen first. Then begin building your new normal on an intentional effort to improve. But there's one last thing that happens in this story that I don't want to miss. These disciples have been through trauma. They've been through the experience of processing. They've seen the value in their trauma. And then they're in a position for this story to end exactly the way that it should have ended. I'm going to pick up reading in verse 30. When he was at the table with them, he took the bread and blessed and broke it and gave it to them. And their eyes were opened and they recognized him. And he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Did our hearts not burn within us while he talked to us on the road, while he opened to us the scriptures?" With the benefits of walking one step at a time, processing through their pain with the direct help of Jesus, they get to a place of peace. They're at their destination. They're finally able to sit down to a meal. The meaning in their pain has been revealed. And in that moment, Jesus chooses to reveal himself. These disciples then look back at their traumatic experience and begin to recognize Jesus where they had previously missed him. They say to each other, "That feeling we both had in the midst of this processing, that was Jesus." It puts the entire experience into a new context. It turns pain into joy. So much joy, in fact, that they go, as the scripture we read indicates. We move on a bit, and it says that they rose up at that same hour to go back to Jerusalem. Remember, that's 7 miles. That's a long walk. I imagine it was slow going on the way there, but on the way back, I imagine there was some running involved because these guys are really excited now. They can't contain themselves. This moment is amazing, and I want it to apply to us as well. I want us to be able to look back at this traumatic experience and see Jesus. I think once our process is complete, Jesus will be much easier to spot in this mess, but I don't think it's necessary to have to wait to start that process. So I want you to ask yourself every day, where do I see Jesus today? I did a podcast a few weeks ago with the ministry staff about that very question. Where do I see Jesus every day? Begin that process now. And then I think it'll be even more prominent when we're through the trauma. So to recap today, trauma is life-changing. We're experiencing a moment of trauma right now. So take the road to Emmaus story as a guide for how to handle it. Move slowly, but move. Take time to process. Find value in the experience. And finally, look for Jesus. Turn this trauma into the catalyst for God-honoring change. If we don't do that now, I think we've missed a golden opportunity. This traumatic experience that we're all sharing collectively is going to change things. It's going to change the way we view the world. We don't get to control that. We don't get to control the fact that change is coming. We don't get to control the fact that this traumatic experience has taken place. We do have a lot of control over what that looks like and whether this traumatic moment is something that benefits our family for generations to come. Or whether this is a traumatic moment that we just kind of grit our teeth and get through and then try to get back to normal as fast as possible. That sounds like a waste to me. I hope it does to you as well. As always, I miss you. I appreciate you spending time with me this morning. I'm going to leave you with the questions that I asked you previously. I'm going to put them on the slide again. So if you'd like to see them, you can push pause on those questions. Eastridge, I look forward to seeing you again very, very soon. You're in my prayers. And I can't wait to hug you.